and go. Lots of go.
Right.
for that era.
And they came with I believe a V10, correct?
All of them. That's all they put in the Vipers were V10s, and they were all standard transmissions.
Mm-hmm.
And they started out with an 8-liter. It was around 400 horses. And the next generation was still the 8-liter, and it was like 450 horse, something like that.
Mm-hmm.
And then they started making an 8.3-liter and started climbing up to 500, then over 500. And mine is an 8.4-liter, which is 512 cubic inches. And there's been a fight over the horsepower rating between the government and the EPA and Chrysler and the insurance companies. The insurance companies really have a hand in a lot of this. They had a lot to do with the first generation or second generation, whichever one to look at. The 426s that everybody's so familiar with.
Mm-hmm.
The insurance companies had a lot to do with Chrysler having to say, well, that's the end of it. We're going to stop producing them
because the insurance was just too expensive.
Absolutely.
Yeah, yes. And in a way, I mean, to be fair, insurance companies work off of actuarial tables, and
sure.
if the tables say, look, we have to charge this for insurance if we're going to go ahead and come out ahead, and if that is off the charts, well, they're either going to stop offering the insurance or it's going to be unbelievably high. Like California, there are parts of California, rural California, where people still live in the woods. They can't insure their homes anymore because there's too many of them that burn down, and the insurance companies aren't going to make money, so they quit selling them insurance. I guess the big Chrysler cars were the same way.
The insurance company had really more control over what Chrysler built than what Chrysler had control over. It seemed that way. And of course, that's about the time the air pollution regulations started kicking in,
mm-hmm.
and then OPEC wanted their foot in the door, and it all came down to the fact that this just isn't feasible any longer.
Well, you would think that OPEC would love an engine that was a V12 and burned a ton of fuel.
Yeah, and then President Nixon coming out with that 55-mile-an-hour speed limit
mm-hmm.
on the interstates. That between all that and then that kicking in, that didn't help the big Hemis.
But yeah, the first generation of the muscle cars.
Yes,
mm-hmm.
yes, they. And let's face it, we all know as far as pollution goes, they weren't friendly to our environment.
No, they weren't at all. In fact, years ago, I worked with a guy. He was an engineer at Harley Davidson, and he used to be an engineer at General Motors. And he made the statement one time that a 1960 Chevy Impala sitting in your garage pollutes more than the newest Chevy Impala that drives down the road. And I believe that because once upon a time, if you walked into a garage with a car in it, it smelled like gasoline.
Sure.
It wasn't even a sealed system. You had the blowpipe that basically was a vent to the gas tank. And
in 1960, it was leaded gasoline.
That's exactly right. Right. So I understand what they're saying. But to take and just get rid of a car like the Viper, I mean, let's be honest. They weren't selling 300,000 Vipers a year.
Nope.
So if you look at it from that standpoint, sure, they were big polluters, but there weren't enough of them they weren't even a rounding error on the scale.
No, they when the last generation of the Viper came out, that's also about the time that General Motors came out with the supercharged Corvette.
Okay.
And let's face it, the Corvette's a fine automobile. It's a piece of America. It's Americana.
Mm-hmm.
You know, and I can't say a thing bad. I can't say anything bad about them. I can't.
Well,
They're a piece of America. They're just as much of America as apple pie.
and once upon a time, they used to build them here in St. Louis too.
They sure did.
And,
They absolutely did. I got to see that. We took a tour of it. Our high school, one of the high school classes I had. We got to tour the assembly plant up there.
Well, I've never been into the assembly plant in St. Louis, but I have been to the assembly plant and museum in Bowling Green, Kentucky, where they build them now.
Mm-hmm.
And I will tell you, I've never been a huge fan of Corvettes. I mean, I've liked them. Don't get me wrong; they're wonderful cars, but they were always an older guy's car. I thought, okay. And maybe as I'm becoming older, I kind of like them. But this brand new mid-engine Corvette, to me, is just unbelievable. It's a beautiful piece of machinery. I love it.
It is. We seen one chasing a Tesla the other day.
Well, I will tell you,
I don't know if he ever caught him, but he chased him.
I doubt that he did. He'd probably have to go over 200 miles to catch him when it ran out of charge. But yeah, if you're talking about just speed, I drove a buddy's Tesla Model S, and that was by far the fastest car, 0 to whatever, that I'd ever driven. But it just, if you punch the pedal on a internal combustion engine, just that roar and that grovelly growl is just sexy as hell.
That's it, isn't it?
It is.
It's that. I mean, I can see the younger generation that's never had a taste of that, a taste of it, I should say.
Mm-hmm.
I can see them going for the electrics. But our generation, or like my son's generation, there's nothing like that sound. It's just an attraction, just like the Harley Davidson.
It's exactly right. Even back in the 70s, when Harley Davidsons, let's face it, were just they weren't good pieces of machinery. They just weren't. But that sexy chug 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 was a whole lot better than ring 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 from a Japanese engine. Okay, it just was. It's just a sexy sound. And I get it. Electric engines, I mean, electric motors, they're the future. An electric motor has 2 moving parts on it. How many moving parts does an internal combustion engine have?
Oh, my.
Exactly.
Yeah.
They're simple, they're basic, they're easy, they're economical to operate. As soon as they figure out the batteries, and they will, and the charging system, and they will, it'll be the only way to go. But there's something sexy about that growl, and younger people get it too. Of course, my car's my daily driver is a 2017 Jaguar XE, and it's got the 3.0 liter supercharged engine, and that was the biggest. In fact, that's the same block as the V8, but they left out 2 cylinders. Why, I don't know. Same block, they just didn't put pistons in the last 2 cylinders, but I pulled out in traffic one time, and as soon as I pulled out in traffic, I realized I'd pulled out right in front of this guy. I thought, "Oh my gosh!" So I punched it, and I just it's a supercharger, not a turbocharger, so there's absolutely no lag. It just
no lag time.
No lag time.
Yes.
It screamed, it howled, and I got out of his way in no time. And I looked in my rearview mirror, expecting the guy to be flipping me off because I'd cut him off. No, not at all. He had his hands in the air cheering because of the way that car took off when I punched it. He thought it was very cool that I pulled out in front of him and then got out of his way in such a record time.
Isn't it such an adrenaline gush that when someone passes you, instead of flipping you off, they give you a thumbs up and a smile?
Yeah.
It really is, and it makes you appreciate the human being again, after fighting in traffic and everything, and the abuse you take in a daily driver.
Yeah. And I'm sure, you mentioned that you get people that compliment your Viper all the time. They ask questions, they compliment you, they talk about how cool the car is. When I drove an 06 Malibu, nobody ever said that. And there was nothing wrong with that Malibu. But it was a Malibu, okay? Just a plain
very
old,
functional.
yeah, very functional everyday car.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. My Saturn Sky Redline, which I drive a lot in the summertime. It's a convertible. My Jaguar. People comment on those cars all the time.
Yes.
And
Yes.
as I've said before many times, if, in my opinion, especially if you're a car guy or a car gal, if you're not, after you park the car, walk away from it, if you're not turning around, taking a look at that car and smiling, you need to drive a different car.
Yeah, it happens every time we park in the garage. I'm in no hurry to get out of it. I'm just sitting there admiring it. And
Yeah.
Now there's a fine line between arrogancy and just love, you know.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm not arrogant about it at all, but I'm very proud of it.
Well, sure. You can say,
I'm
look,
proud of what I've accomplished in my life, and including that car.
well, and you've got to figure, and you mentioned it earlier in the podcast. When you're a younger man with limited resources, you can window shop all you want, but the harsh reality is you have other things going on. You're not making that much money. Perhaps you're married, starting a family. You can't waste money on stuff like that. Cool cars. Okay. You just can't, not with a good conscience. When you get older, when the kids are grown, when you got a little bit of money in the bank, that's when you can go ahead and write a check for the dream.
And people of our age, they're old enough to remember, like I mentioned, the unleaded gasoline, and when cars weren't as dependable. Shucks, I remember going down the highway and my dad losing a wheel cover off his car. And that thing would actually pass you for a moment going down the highway till it hit the ditch, the wheel covers.
Yep.
And look at the autos now. Now, if I remember correctly, the Jags, in fact, I know it for certain. At one time, they had a problem of dependability. And
that's being kind.
Yeah, well, I try to respect all autos and all folks until I have reason not to. But
sure,
they had a dependability issue, reliability issue, and wasn't it Ford that eventually became the owner of the Jaguar brand?
They did. Ford bought Jaguar, then they bought Land Rover, and then they bought Aston Martin. And they turned those three vehicles into fairly dependable cars.
Yes, they did. That's where I was headed with that.
Now,
yes.
The bad side of it is they removed the soul from the car because they were no longer cool-looking cars. They were pretty good-looking cars, but they got you to work. I mean, before Ford bought Jaguar, Car and Driver magazine basically said, look, if you need a car that's dependable to get you to and from work, don't buy a Jaguar. They were that undependable. They just were. Mm-hmm. They all had they don't still, but they used to have the Lucas Electronics, and Lucas Electronics are suspect to say to the least. In fact, the old joke is, why do the British drink their beer warm? And the answer is because Lucas makes the refrigerators.
I've never heard that.
Yeah, the other old Jaguar joke was the Jaguar engineer and the Mercedes-Benz engineer were talking about quality of their cars and how tight the doors would seal on the cars. And the Mercedes-Benz engineer said, here's what we do for a test for our cars for Mercedes-Benz. We put a cat in the car overnight. We close the doors. And in the morning, if the cat is dead, we figure the car is airtight enough and we pass the inspection. The Jaguar engineer said, well, we have a similar test also. We also put a cat in the car at the end of the day and close the doors. And when we come back in the morning, if the cat hasn't escaped, it's tight enough.
That's new to me. That's new.
Yeah, but they've improved their quality a lot. I mean, my 2017 has never had a real problem. A few minor problems here or there that were covered under warranty, but they're very dependable cars now.
Well, let's face it, they're man-made, and anything that's man-made is prone to failure.
Well, that's true. And when Tata Motors, an Indian company, bought the car company from Ford, they put $2 billion into making the car run dependably.